Welcome to this explainer. Look, we're diving right in today because we are unpacking one of the most fascinating and honestly deeply human military stories of the late 20th century. We are looking at the South Lebanon Army, or the SLA. We'll be taking a strictly neutral, fact-based approach to break down the dramatic rise, the heavy institutional power, and the sudden, totally chaotic collapse of an entire proxy army. Let's get into it.
So what actually happens when an entire army is just abandoned overnight? Well, on May 24, 2000, that wasn't some hypothetical scenario. It was a terrifying, boots-on-the-ground reality for thousands of soldiers and their families. But to really grasp the sheer panic of that day, we kind of need to rewind and see exactly how the geopolitical pressure cooker of the Middle East reached this exact boiling point.
To make this history feel real, I want you to picture a little 6-year-old boy named G. Out of nowhere, your dad runs into the house, tells the whole family to pack right this second, and literally moments later, you are crammed into a car heading south with just a few bags strapped to the roof. Confused, terrified, you're joining thousands of people fleeing toward a border fence. This right here is the visceral human reality behind the grand geopolitical chess game we're about to explore.
Okay, so here's our roadmap for today. We're going to cover 1. Origins of a proxy army. 2. Antoine Lahad's command. 3. The May 2000 withdrawal. 4. Fleeing across the border. 5. Diverging fates. And finally, 6. A complex legacy.
All right, jumping right into Section 1, Origins of a Proxy Army. To understand how the SLA even came to be, we've got to go back to the 1970s. The Lebanese state was essentially collapsing under the massive weight of a brutal civil war. Central authority just completely vanished, and this created a huge security vacuum in southern Lebanon, which, as you might guess, was quickly filled by various armed factions and militias.
Now, what's truly wild about this timeline is how quickly pure necessity created some very strange bedfellows. In 1976, as the official Lebanese armed forces were fragmenting, a Lebanese army major named Saad Haddad reached out and established contact with UDL, which was the Israeli military's liaison unit. Fast forward to 1978, Israel launches Operation Litani to clear factions from the border area, and they actually turn the territory over to Haddad's forces. Just 1 year later in 1979, Haddad unilaterally declares an independent state of free Lebanon.
And that brings us to exactly what this force became by 1980, the South Lebanon Army. Objectively speaking, it was a Lebanese militia that was armed, funded, and directed by Israel to secure a buffer zone along the border. Now, the government up in Beirut officially branded them traitors, but the militia members themselves, they viewed things very differently. They saw themselves as local protectors, allying with Israel out of mutual necessity just to defend their own home region.
Moving right along to Section 2, Antoine Lahad's command. When Saad Haddad passed away in 1984, the militia obviously needed a new leader. So Israel recruits retired Lebanese Army Major General Antoine Lahad. Lahad was a highly professional officer, and his main goal was to transform what was essentially a ragtag local militia into a highly institutionalized, disciplined military machine.
$35 million. Let that number sink in for a second. That was the estimated annual Israeli subsidy for the SLA. Under Lahad, we are not talking about some small guerrilla outfit here. They were incredibly well-funded. I'm talking American Sherman and Soviet T-54 tanks, heavy artillery, and they even operated 3 full regional hospitals. Plus, the soldiers were pulling in average monthly salaries of between $500 and $600, which was huge. It was a massive, massive logistical operation.
Now, a super common misconception is that the SLA was just a purely Christian militia. But looking at the demographics, they tell a completely different story. 50% Christian, 30% Shia Muslim, 13% Druze, and 7% Sunni Muslim. The SLA actually reflected the incredibly complex, confessional diversity of Lebanon itself, pulling its ranks directly from the local population of that southern border region.
And Lahad deeply institutionalized this force. He actually modeled its structure directly on the Israeli Defense Forces. They set up dedicated specialized brigades for military intelligence, operations, logistics, military police, and even an engineering and medical corps. It was this deep organizational structure that made the SLA such a formidable regional force for well over a decade.
Which brings us to Section 3, the May 2000 withdrawal. By the late 1990s, the geopolitical winds were shifting, and they were shifting fast. Inside Israel, mounting military casualties in that security zone were heavily eroding domestic support for the occupation. Simply put, the Israeli public wanted out.
Let's walk through exactly how this unraveled, step by step.
First, newly elected Israeli Prime Minister Ehud Barak pledges a unilateral withdrawal. Then, in mid-May, hoping to avert more Israeli casualties, the IDF starts handing their forward military outposts over to the SLA. But here's the catch. The SLA knew they couldn't hold off the advancing Hezbollah forces all alone without Israeli air and artillery support. So total panic sets in. The SLA starts abandoning their posts, triggering a total domino effect collapse, and Israel is forced to order an immediate, rapid evacuation weeks ahead of schedule.
And get this, the SLA commander himself, Antoine Lahad, he was actually on holiday in France when this sudden pullout went down, completely blindsided by his sponsors. He later famously said, "I vehemently opposed a withdrawal without an agreement, and look what happened. A unilateral withdrawal without any sort of structured exit strategy literally dismantled his entire army overnight."
Let's look at Section 4, fleeing across the border. With the command structure completely vanished and Israeli forces pulling back, the rank-and-file soldiers of the SLA were left entirely on their own to fend off the advancing forces.
The result was absolute, unmitigated chaos. Over 6,000 SLA militiamen and their families suddenly rushed the border to escape. But here is the heartbreaking logistical reality of that day. Israel just wasn't ready for them. For 2 agonizing days, thousands of these families were stuck right at the border gates, trapped between the advancing forces and an Israeli border bureaucracy that hesitated. It was really only after international pressure mounted that Israel finally opened the gates to let their former allies in.
But arriving in Israel didn't magically mean finding a home. Let's go back to the story of young G, that 6-year-old we talked about earlier. Once his family resettled in Israel, he faced a massive identity crisis. Our sources note he was actually ashamed to eat his traditional Lebanese lunch, the lafa with labaneh, at school. He literally threw his sandwiches away just to avoid being bullied and labeled an Arab by the local kids. It's a painful irony, isn't it? His family fled to Israel for safety, only to face deep suspicion and stereotyping from the very society they had fought alongside.
All right, Section 5, Diverging Fates. The total collapse of the South Lebanon Army essentially split its members down 2 vastly different paths, and it all depended on the choices they made during those frantic few days in May 2000.
You see, many of the rank-and-file soldiers, often guys who had joined purely for economic reasons or were even forcibly conscripted, they chose to just stay in Lebanon. They surrendered to the Lebanese armed forces, faced military trials, and generally received relatively lenient sentences, eventually reintegrating back into Lebanese society. But on the flip side, those who fled to Israel, mostly mid to high-ranking officers and their families, were initially thrown into military bases, struggling with an intense identity crisis and a really profound sense of displacement.
Let's wrap up with Section 6, a complex legacy. It's been decades since the SLA collapsed, but the echoes of this proxy conflict, they are still very loudly felt today, especially when you look at the younger generation. Today, roughly 3,600 Lebanese from these families still live in Israel. And while some of the older generation definitely still struggle with housing and economic integration, the youth are carving out this really fascinating dual identity. Over 650 of them have actually served in the Israeli Defense Forces, viewing it as a clear path to integration. At the same time, many, just like G, have completely transformed their childhood shame into pride. They are actively reclaiming their Lebanese heritage while living their lives in Israel.
But man, you really have to contrast that youthful resilience with the fate of the old guard. General Antoine Lahad, the guy who commanded a $35 million a year army, was condemned to death in absentia by a Lebanese court. He tried to settle in France, was denied residency, briefly opened a restaurant in Tel Aviv, and ultimately died in exile in Paris in 2015. It's a stark, incredibly isolated end for a leader who was entirely abandoned by the shifting tides of geopolitics.
So, it leaves us with this final thought. How do you reconcile a legacy of proxy warfare with the search for home? Because the story of the SLA isn't just about military strategy or tanks or buffer zones. It's a profound, lasting lesson in the human cost of geopolitical alliances and exactly what happens to the people left behind when the strategic priorities of nations just change overnight. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep asking those big questions, and I'll see you next time.